The Pinkertons, Chapter 8. Back in Haypepper, and back in the year our story is taking place, the untoward but not entirely unexpected effects of the carrot crunch upon Patty's brother seemed to be showing no signs of abating any time soon. Patty would need to take Percival somewhere quiet to wait for her brother to calm down a little. She looked around her. Claude and Cynthia were still over at the vegetable stall, examining heads of broccoli. Her mother seemed engrossed in the task. Patty's father, however, looked up, caught his daughter's eye, and gave her a merry wave with his thin pink paw. But neither of Patty's parents came to her aid, being, as they were, in blissful ignorance of their son's current condition. Patty considered. She could possibly attempt to steer Percival over to Mr. and Mrs. Pinkerton. But there were so many stalls in between where she was standing, clinging on to her brother by one of the tufts on his back, and where her parents were huddled together over at the vegetable stall. And not only were there the stalls, but there were also several dozen guinea pig shoppers, each bustling about busily, and most carrying a bag, box, or basket, or sometimes all three at once. To Patty's mind, it was all beginning to feel more like an obstacle course than a market, and a taxing obstacle course at that, one that she would have found difficult to negotiate with her accident-prone brother on a good day, let alone on a day like today, when he was still suffering the effects of the carrot crunch. No, that option, it seemed to her, was closed. And in any case, she reasoned, lovely though her parents were, they probably wouldn't be much help. No, it was down to her. She was the one with the brains. As Patty was reaching this conclusion, Percival suddenly and unexpectedly popcorned again, and because Patty was holding on to him, she was jousted unceremoniously right up into the air. Patty landed awkwardly with a bit of a bump. She checked herself over carefully, because guinea pigs have very many small bones that can easily be damaged. But no, apart from one or two bruises, which she suspected would be there, although of course because of her guinea pig hairstyle it was impossible to see them and know for sure, she seemed relatively unharmed. Patty looked up. Where was Percival? She looked around. Her eyes lingered on Miss Mahala's stall. This was once again doing a roaring trade, and seemed none the worse for wear after the earlier excitements. Miss Mahala was talking animatedly to her steady stream of customers. The shy gentleman guinea pig in the green dungarees and red cap was now standing beside her at the low table. He was helping her to wrap up the parcels, a task at which he was proving himself surprisingly nimble-pawed. Occasionally he was stealing a glance at the lovely lady next to him, whereupon he would give a deep crimson blush, or so I like to imagine at any rate. Of course, in reality, his blushes, like Patty's bruises, would have been completely concealed by his guinea pig locks. In any case, the shy gentleman guinea pig looked as though he couldn't believe his luck. The wearers of the pin-striped trousers and black polished boots were now nowhere to be seen. But neither was Percival. Patty looked over at the vegetable stall. Her parents had now turned their attention to a pile of red peppers and did not see her. But no, Percival was not with them. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she glimpsed him, or at least she glimpsed his back end, disappearing into a little teepee that she had not previously noticed. How had it escaped her notice? She had no idea, because the teepee was hardly inconspicuous. It was brightly coloured, with purple, turquoise and gold swirls all around the outside, and each coloured swirl was outlined with a row of sequins in the same colour. These sequins were now catching the light and twinkling like 1,000 little dancing stars. Over the entrance was a sign. Spidery lettering invited visitors to enter, welcoming them to Clover and Stars, Emporium of Magical Miscellany. Miss Clover and Miss Star had made several changes to their little shop in the time since we last visited it, dear reader. The most obvious change, perhaps, was that George was no longer working there. No, despite his doubtful work ethic and inefficiency, Miss Clover and Miss Star had not fired him. That was not it. No, he had moved to London. He had got a job running an antiques dealership, a very large concern by all accounts, compared to which the Emporium was small fry. George had been very excited about his move before he'd left, but neither Miss Clover or Miss Star had heard anything from him since, so they hadn't heard how he was getting on in his new job. Although Miss Clover and Miss Star were about the two most charitable ladies you could ever meet, both of them had been a little surprised at George's meteoric rise. Indeed, Miss Clover had secretly wondered whether he might have embellished his CV a little in order to bolster his case, for, with the best will in the world, it seemed a very big leap from a not very effective part-time assistant at the Emporium to becoming the global managing director of Rich and Refined Rusty Rarities for the Discerning Guinea Pig. Miss Clover understood from George that even to enter Rich and Refined, one had to have an appointment. You couldn't just walk in off the street. This was apparently because the business was so picky about its clientele. Miss Star had had the following uncharacteristic thought. Maybe they need to be a little bit more picky about their staff too. So George was gone, and in his place was a new assistant called Simmy Chai. We have actually met Simmy Chai before. We just didn't know his name at that point. Simmy Chai was, of course, the lovely shy gentleman in the green dungarees and red cap. He had scampered out from the Emporium where he was working and over to help Miss Mihaela at her stall when he had heard that her stall had gone into disarray. Even now, Simmy Chai was still standing next to that lady, adhering pictures of her lovely face onto tiny packages wrapped up in brown paper. Miss Clover and Miss Star had asked Simmy about his surname. He didn't really know its origins, but both the ladies had felt that it would be reassuring to work alongside someone whose name reminded one of cups of tea. This was probably the main reason that they had offered him the job on the spot when he had come in to respond to the job advertisement that had been pinned on the outside of the teepee. Another reason he got the job may have been that he had been the sole applicant. It was a funny thing, but not everyone seemed to notice that the Emporium was there. Most folks didn't seem to see it for some reason, and presumably that had meant that they wouldn't have seen the job advertisement either. I have often speculated on why this was, dear reader. I mean, on why so few were able to see the teepee. Were they unable to see it because it was too large? For it was large, of course. Not particularly large inside, but it was tall enough for George, even in his hat. And of course, if you remember, George was a human, even if a relatively short one. And it strikes me that sometimes really big things are actually less easy to notice than small things, or things on our own scale, the scale we are used to. It's a funny thing that, but I think it can be true. Interestingly, as Miss Clover and Miss Star often note, even those who have seen the Emporium once, and even those who have gone inside, like Cynthia, might never see it again. The two ladies have no explanation for this, and I'm not sure that I do either, except that maybe folk don't want to see things again, especially things that are a little different, or thought-provoking, or magical, I suppose. Then again, perhaps it is just because on the normal guinea pig scale of things, there were so many other things to be looking at and thinking about and getting on with. In any case, for Patty and Percival Pinkerton, who will shortly re-enter our story, this was certainly the first time they'd ever noticed the brightly coloured teepee, and their parents had been bringing them along to market day at Haypepper ever since Patty and Percival were tiny babies. Although, of course, Percival would want me to point out that he was definitely the elder sibling even at that point. Now, despite their lack of a list of candidates to choose from, Miss Clover and Miss Star were delighted with their new assistant. Simmy was kind, he was polite, both to them and to customers. He was helpful, and he was good at inventing fairy tales, with which he would entertain the two ladies as they sipped their afternoon cups of tea in their miniature cups. Simmy Chai also had a secret, which he had confessed early on to Miss Clover and Miss Star. It was this: Simmy Chai would really have liked to ask Miss Mahala to marry him, but he hadn't yet plucked up the courage even to ask her on a date, and she hadn't shown any signs yet of asking him either, although he suspected that she might like him. She certainly smiled at him a lot, but then she seemed to smile at everyone. She was simply a very smiley guinea pig. The two old ladies, for by this time in our story, Miss Clover and Miss Star were really quite elderly, loved to listen to Simmy's hopes and dreams, and they would encourage him and offer him bits of advice. They watched any developments in his love life with great interest. They actually found it almost exciting and enlivening. There were other changes in the emporium too. The ashtray was gone, and the joss sticks, if now used at all, were only used one at a time, which worked better in the space. And in fact, it was more usual for there to be, instead, a pretty little glass bowl of water sitting on the table, filled with floating, gently rose-scented candles, their little wicks flickering merrily with their tiny flames. The shelf melting device no longer caused any problems, you will be pleased to hear. In the end, the shelving units had to be removed in their entirety. It must be said that they had been a little unwilling to go, so it had not been easy. Those tricksy shelves really did have a mind of their own, but finally they were gone for good. I think it is possible that the previous owners of the teepee had been rather peculiar folk, but we need not worry about that now, because whoever they were, they are now long gone, and you couldn't get two nicer or kinder guinea pigs than Miss Clover and Miss Star. In place of the tricksy shelves had come new units made from bamboo canes. These were most attractive, and they were also, I am pleased to report, much better behaved than their predecessors. I suppose, though, that even these new units were just a little bit magical in their own way, for every so often they would sprout a few dark green papery leaves here and there. But these new shelves also definitely had their feet on the ground, both literally and metaphorically. Miss Clover and Miss Star were very pleased with the new arrangements. It all felt homely, but also a little exotic and oriental, all at the same time. The guinea pig ladies had also carefully re-examined their stock and had taken various items off sale. These items were mostly residual stock that had been left by the previous owners. In fact, after the unfortunate incident with Cynthia, Miss Clover had suggested to Miss Star that they should perhaps desist from selling any magical items at all. Miss Star had agreed, and they had set about restocking the shop with items that were still exquisitely beautiful, special, and unusual, but that were not, strictly speaking, magical. Miss Clover had wondered whether they ought to rename the shop, but Miss Star had pointed out that as so few people even seemed to be able to see the sign, there was probably little point in getting it repainted. Simi Chai had further pointed out that the existing signage was not too misleading because the emporium itself, the teepee, was still magical, even if the items for sale were not. He felt that the teepee must be magical in some way, otherwise why was it that people couldn't see it? Miss Clover and Miss Star were not totally convinced by his logic, and neither am I, dear reader, for the name was the Emporium of Magical Miscellany, which surely implies it was the miscellany that was magical and not the teepee. But never mind, I don't wish to split hairs, and neither did Miss Clover and Miss Star, so the name remained. And in any case, we should probably get back to what was happening to Patty and Percival. Patty and Percival Pinkerton entered the tent. Miss Clover and Miss Star scurried over to greet them. At once, Miss Star noticed that something was wrong. She spotted Patty's worried expression, and then, almost immediately, she noticed Percival's erratic movements. Miss Clover cooed soothingly over the young guinea pigs. And although the Emporium was, of course, technically a shop rather than a cafe, the two elderly ladies had soon settled the youngsters into comfy armchairs, also new, and served Patty a cup of tea. Percival would have to wait a while until the popcorning had completely stopped. He couldn't be trusted with a cup of hot liquid just now. Patty had helped Miss Clover and Miss Star to pack lots of cushions around Percival, so that whichever way he jumped, he would not hurt himself. Patty finally began to relax. Percival would hopefully do no further damage. His popcorning was now subsiding anyway, and she was finding the tea delicious and restorative. She didn't often get to drink tea at home, so this was a bit of a treat. Miss Clover and Miss Star seemed so very kind, Patty thought. She wondered how it was that she had never noticed the teepee before. Was it new, she wondered? It didn't look it. Miss Clover and Miss Star looked settled in, very well settled in. They did not look like new arrivals at all. Just then, Simi Chai returned. He started to explain to Miss Clover and Miss Star what had happened, for he had gone out to investigate the commotion over half an hour ago, and this was him returning only now. He caught sight of Percival and Patty. "Aha!" he said. In Guinea Pig, this sounds like an excited whoop. "And here are the culprits!" Patty was worried that this guinea pig in green dungarees, whoever he was about to start telling her off. But Simi Chai didn't tell them off. Instead, he grinned broadly. He seemed very pleased about something. "So it's you I need to thank," he said, looking at Patty and Percival. Simi Chai went on to explain to the two elderly ladies how he had ended up helping Miss Mihaela and how he had got to stand beside her at her stall and wrap up some of the parcels. Now you might think that the two ladies would be thinking, "Are we paying this chap good money to go out and help out in a different business and to chat to pretty ladies?" But Miss Clover and Miss Star were not thinking this at all, for 4 reasons. Firstly, these were very kind, patient, and charitable ladies. Secondly, Simi Chai was actually a good and hard worker. Thirdly, they had become very fond of him. And fourthly, Miss Clover and Miss Star were deeply interested in Simi's love life, as perhaps only elderly, unmarried lady guinea pigs can be, and they always waited with bated breath to hear of any developments in the relationship between their assistant and the proprietress of the confectionery stall. As Simi continued to talk away, Patty remembered that she still had a little bit of pocket money left over, and she thought she would have a little browse around the shop. Percival was now back to his usual self, but Patty felt it would be a wise precaution for him to remain as he was, surrounded by cushions. So Percival sat and watched as his sister, fully restored by her tea, looked around the emporium. There were lots of lovely things. Patty didn't know what to choose. Miss Starr was looking at her. "What about this, dear?" she suggested. "This might be fun." Miss Starr was holding up a brightly coloured box. Patty looked confused. Miss Starr explained. "It's a clockwork radio, dear." Patty Pinkerton did not think that her small amount of pocket money would stretch as far as a radio. She was sure that it must be expensive. Patty had only had a few coins in her purse to start with, and she had already spent most of these at Miss Mahala's stall on the bouquet surprise for herself and the hay twists for her mother and father. She took a moment now to feel in her special blue shopping pouch that she had strapped to her tummy, just to check that all these things were still there and had not fallen out with all the excitement. No, everything was still there, if a little squished. Miss Starr was still holding up the box and looking inquiringly at Patty. "I don't think I have enough coins for that, I'm afraid," said Patty. Miss Starr waved her paw airily. "Oh, I shouldn't worry about that, but please do be straightforward with me. Would you like a radio? I wouldn't want you to go away with something that you didn't actually want, just because you were trying to be polite." Patty considered. She would love a radio. It would be such fun. Percival would enjoy it too, she thought. She glanced over at her brother. He was nodding his head vigorously. Miss Starr took matters into her own paws. "Well, how much do you have?" she asked. Patty held out 3 little coins in her front paw for the elderly guinea pig to see. Yes," said Miss Starr. "Just one of these will do just fine," she said, pointing to the smallest of the 3 coins. "If you're sure you'd like the radio, that is." Miss Starr was looking at Patty kindly. "Yes, please," said Patty quietly, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "That would be amazing." Later on, Miss Clover turned to Miss Starr. "Isn't it so lovely now that we don't have any magical goods to worry about? One doesn't have to be on one's toes all the time anymore. It was getting a little tiresome, you know. It's so much nicer knowing that we can sell anything at all from the shop now without there being the slightest risk of magical misadventure." Miss Starr nodded. "Oh, yes, Miss Clover, I couldn't agree more. Take that clockwork radio that the children went away with today. Nothing remotely magical about it, and yet they were so pleased with it, and nothing can go wrong. Nothing." Miss Clover smiled, and the 2 elderly ladies settled back into their armchairs, and Simmy Chai poured each of them a nice cup of tea.